So I hope that most of you were able to, well, no, not most of you. I hope all of you missed me so much that you had to listen to the podcast on Tuesday, just because otherwise you'd suffer withdrawal symptoms. This is the third in this sequence of lectures about the late 19th and early 20th century. So just to backtrack to begin with, the last two lectures were about the economic and social challenges to liberalism that emerged in the decades after the 1870s, and the ways in which they began to call into question some of the assumptions that had framed the sort of liberal understanding of the world that had emerged in the early 19th century. This lecture looks at the political challenges to that liberal common sense. And it does so by looking at forms of political critique that develop both in Britain and across the empire. And then on Thursday, we're going to look at the horror that was at the First World War, an event that is often thought to be the final nail in the coffin of liberal England, although I won't be suggesting that it was so. Now, the key element to these series of challenges that developed in the late 19th century, I think, was shaped by a new type of experience of the world, a new type of global condition that emerges in the late 19th century. The world becomes a much smaller place given the development of new technologies of transportation and communication. And that had, as we saw last week, very important consequences for the reshaping of the world economy in that period. It also had very serious consequences for the global competition for imperial territory. So it was critical to the formation of a new era of imperial expansion, seeking, of course, to capture new economic markets and new forms of geopolitical influence. In a way, the Titanic that you see behind me is a great example of that process. It was built to be the largest ship in the world. It was built with a sense of recognizing that Britain was competing with other countries to be able to produce these vast ships. It was meant to work as an example of the preeminence of British shipping, which of course had been so important to the expansion of the empire from the 18th century. And it was built with the very newest technologies to be able to let this vast ship travel at unprecedented speeds across the Atlantic to the US, which was becoming Britain's major economic rival at this time, and built also in the context of a massive period of the acceleration of the arms race in the decade before the First World War, which primarily took the shape of naval competition with Germany, the attempt to match the speed of the growth of the German Navy. But I'm also going to suggest today that the Titanic is a good image to start with because, like the Titanic, liberalism begins to hit an iceberg. That liberalism itself becomes seems to be proceeding well, seems to be part of this great confidence in liberal progress, and yet hits a major set of challenges. And the challenges that I'm going to suggest, clearly liberalism doesn't hit an iceberg, but it does hit important challenges that undermine its central assumptions. And there are basically three of them that I want to undermine. So that everything that I'm going to be talking about today is trying to show that these central assumptions that had guided liberalism from the early 19th century began to be called into question. The first is free trade and cheap government. That's a sort of cheap because I'm getting to it. The second is a benevolent, civilizing empire. The belief in the empire is necessarily civilizing and benevolent. And the third is the rule of law and the idea that of political representation for all those people that were good liberal persons. Now, you thought that was the introduction, but I thought just for fun I'd throw in another one. This is a lecture that has lots of different beginnings. Because it wasn't just the sinking of the Titanic that seemed to gesture towards the demise of liberalism or liberal ideas of liberal progress. The turn of the 20th century, Melody, if I didn't love you so much, I'd be very cross. At the turn of the 20th century, there are basically two funerals that marked the passage of an era. The funerals of William Gladstone and of Queen Victoria. Remember, William Gladstone had been the dominant political figure of the late 19th century, had been Prime Minister 4 times, Chancellor of the Exchequer 4 times, and had basically been in and out of the cabinet from the 1840s. Totally dominant figure. And Queen Victoria had, of course, been queen since the 1830s. It seemed that the 19th century was really coming to a close, and not just with the turning of January the 1st, 1900. But I want to emphasize that it wasn't all doom and gloom. That I don't want you to assume that there wasn't a vast amount of optimism and belief that Britain was still the greatest country in the world and that liberal progress would unfold for generations. Imperial expansion continued apace. The military spending around the South African War had given the economy a major kickstart, and the economy had come out of the recession that it had been in the 1870s and 1880s. And in all sense, it seemed like Britain may have turned the corner of those difficult final decades of the 19th century. But there were also, alongside that, I think, fears, darker undercurrents, that progress was giving way to its opposite, to forms of degeneration and of decline. You know from the lecture on Tuesday that there was a good deal of anxiety about the scale of poverty and the potential for racial degeneration at home. You're going to find out today that there is increasing political instability. Indeed, some historians even talk about this early Edwardian period in Britain in the first decade and a half of the 20th century as being one where Britain was potentially facing civil war on multiple fronts. And you're going to see today that colonial nationalism becomes a major problem for the British Empire. All of these challenges basically meant that very frequently in this period from 1900 through to the First World War, there were what we would now call states of emergency. States of emergency where the rule of law was thought to be legitimate for the rule of law to be suspended so that violent force could be used to put down the growing political unrest. Rather like, if you like, a contemporary analogy would be after 9/11 and the sort of growth of the security apparatus of the state. Now, the classic account of all of this, all of these events, is George Dangerfield's Strange Death of Liberal England, published in 1936. Still a rollicking good read if any of you want to expand your education. What Dangerfield does is basically provide a story of the way in which the Liberal Party, the political party that was the Liberal Party, was displaced by the Labour Party. And the argument he has is that the Liberal Party was unable to cope with the problem of nationalism in Ireland, the women's movement, and the rise of the Labour movement. That it tried to reinvent itself, it tried to embrace a new liberal philosophy, often described as new liberalism, to try and check the criticisms of these political movements, but that it was unable to. And then the war comes along and finally provides the final nail in the coffin of the party's future electoral success. I'm less interested in this lecture in the health of the Liberal Party, which actually, ironically, as I've just come back from Britain, is having a bit of a rough time at the moment because it's one of its key figures. What is he? A former chief executive of the party has been scandalously shown to have been something of a lech, I think it's fair to say. Anyway, that aside, I'm less interested in the future of the Liberal Party than I am in the way in which these events, as I say, undermine the fundamental assumptions of the liberalism that had crossed both political parties throughout the 19th century. Okay, so let's move on to this first section and talk about the challenges that came to this idea of a benevolent, civilizing empire. You'll remember that for many advocates of free trade, empire was not just an anomaly, but morally wrong. That free trade for people like Cobden and Bright was meant to provide its own civilizing impulse. That you could civilize the rest of the world simply by dint of trading with them. You didn't need to formally colonize them. And that philosophy had an important place in the Liberal Party that emerged in the 1850s and the 1860s. Not a dominant place, but an important place in that party. Nonetheless, it was a position that effectively disappeared in the final decades of the 19th century, in the era of the Great Depression. As I said last week, basically, the Great Depression was a key catalyst for the imperial expansion of European powers, played out most dramatically in the continent of Africa. And Britain began to acquire a good deal of territory in that area. Indeed, it acquired 2.5 million square miles between 1885 and 1896. Kenya became a formal colony in 1880, Egypt in 1882, Somaliland, you don't need to get this, but just to give you an idea, Somaliland in 1884, Nigeria in 1886, Rhodesia in 1889, the Sudan in 1899, and so on. So the idea that you could have imperial influence without formal colonization had begun to evaporate, or had evaporated. And indeed, the question of imperialism and the character of the British Empire moved center stage to political debate in Britain itself. There is a hardening of party political differences around the question of the character of the British Empire. And it went something like this. The Liberal Party, especially the Liberal Party under Gladstone, sought to uphold the civilizing impulse of empire. It was primarily a moral mission, the empire, for Gladstone. When he was famously elected in the late 1860s, he made this profound statement that his mission was to pacify Ireland. And Ireland became an abiding concern for Gladstone. He sought to introduce a number of reforms, like disestablishing the Irish Church in 1869, bringing in a big Land Act in 1870 that tried to take away some of the heat out of the nationalist movement there. But he also wasn't afraid to use the coercive powers of the British colonial state. And indeed, in 1870, a few months after the Land Act, he introduces the Coercion Act as well. So it's a classic balance of reform and repression, like we saw after the revolt in India. Nonetheless, by 1886, Gladstone does something that was really inconceivable a decade earlier, which was to introduce a Home Rule Bill for Ireland that would give Ireland its own parliament and allow it to have continuing representation in the House of Commons in Westminster. That Home Rule Bill was hugely important because it effectively split the Liberal Party. It was actually only narrowly defeated by 30 votes, but more importantly, 93 members of the Liberal Party, led by a figure who's going to be rather important today, a man called Joseph Chamberlain, that you see represented here behind me in a monocle, led these rebels and broke away from the Liberal Party. And they broke away calling themselves Liberal Unionists. Liberals who wanted to defend the Union of Ireland with the United Kingdom. 78 of those rebels, of those Liberal Unionists, were re-elected at the following election, and many of them, like Chamberlain, made the journey across the House to become members of the Conservative Party in the following decades. Now, the Conservative Party had a rather different view of the empire. They were much less interested in its moralizing impulse, the idea of being able to provide liberty or freedom to colonial peoples, than in the idea of using empire as an electoral strategy and as something to shore up and to promote the interests of Britain itself. And so under Benjamin Disraeli in the 1870s, and then later Joseph Chamberlain, the Conservative Party presents the empire as a way of protecting British jobs and of moving away from a free trade ideology. It's Chamberlain who first does this. It's Chamberlain who is the first person who begins to talk about the absurdity of a free trade empire and suggests that instead Britain embraces protection embraces protection in a way that will enhance intercolonial trade through a system of imperial tariffs, so that trade within the empire would be able to go on without customs duty raises and customs duties, and those outside of the British Empire would be subjected to those protectionist tariffs. This split basically sets the tone of the debate that would run for the first 3 decades of the 20th century. That debate between free trade and protection, split between the Liberal and the Conservative parties, both with their different views of the uses of empire, ran through to 1931, when Britain finally abandoned its free trade policy. The final part of this imperial jigsaw puzzle is the very important role of colonial nationalism. And I'm going to talk to you about this in a variety of ways. I'm going to talk about India, I'm going to talk about South Africa, and later I'm going to talk about Ireland as well. Okay? But let me start with these rather horrendous pictures, images from India. Both of these images come from famine scenes in Madras in 1877. The first is obviously of emaciated, starving bodies, and the other is the representation in the Illustrated London News of a famine relief camp. The British Empire had, of course, you'll remember from Queen Victoria's proclamation, promised that it would bring moral and material progress to its Indian subjects. Okay? Indeed, every year they published a report called the Moral and Material Progress Report that sought to illustrate what progress had been made under British rule. But colonial nationalists began to develop a biting critique of British rule by using famine as a sign of its evident failure. Something like 15 million Indians die from famine-related deaths between 1859 and 1899. 15 million people in the course of 40 years after the imposition of direct rule. And figures like Dabadai Naoroji, who's really the key figure here in the 1860s and 1870s, say that the famines are a consequence of Britain's drain of wealth from India. That what it is, that instead of augmenting the wealth of India, that Britain drained India of its wealth by paying unproductive colonial officials vast salaries, imposing unbearable tax burdens upon its people, and making Indians carry the cost of supporting the standing army, the Indian Army, which was used widely across the Indian Ocean world for protecting Britain's imperial expansion, for instance, in Egypt in 1882. Indeed, Naoroji, and then later on Romesh Dutt, a historian actually, shows that 80% of the population had an income of just 20 rupees a week, when basic subsistence required something almost double that, 34 rupees. So here you have Indian nationalist figures taking exactly the same techniques for understanding the scale of poverty in India as are being used by Booth and Rowntree in Britain itself. Now, Nairoji's book, published in 1901, was called Poverty and Un-British Rule in India. And for Nairoji, the un-British part of that rule was the absence of prosperity. The fact that Britain hadn't delivered on its promises. Nairoji was a great believer in free trade. He was a great believer in liberalism. Indeed, he stood for election for the British Liberal Party in the 1890s. He didn't get elected, but he stood in the constituency of Finsbury, which was where Mrs. Thatcher ended up getting elected almost 100 years later, or less than 100 years later. Nairoji goes on to be the first leader of the Indian National Congress. An alternative point of view was expressed by Mahad Ranade, who, like Mitchell, after the Irish famine, made a call for a specifically Indian political economy that moved away from free trade and recognized that India's economy needed the type of protection that it had been denied by the imposition of free trade by the British. And these criticisms of British rule in India began to get taken up widely in Britain. So Henry Hyman, a key figure in the Social Democratic Federation, I'll be talking to you about, one of Britain's first, one of the first leading parties for the labour movement, wrote frequently in support of this criticism. He wrote a book called The Ruin of India by British Rule, for instance, published in 1907. The other place where the criticisms of the British Empire were very pointedly discussed was in relation to the South African War, the so-called Boer War, the war of Britain against the Afrikaans in southern Africa. Now, in one way, the South African War seems to be the culmination of 2 decades of imperial expansion in the continent of Africa. Indeed, it's a war that led to a frenzy of patriotic fervour in Britain, which is often used to explain the election of the Conservative Party in 1900 in a so-called khaki election, because everybody was so obsessed with the conduct of the war. And it was in that context that J.A. Hobson was inspired to write his famous study of imperialism that proved so influential for Lenin a decade later. I don't have time to get into Hobson's critique of the empire. I'm just here remarking that the South African War was a key catalyst for it. But the South African War was also a bad thing for Britain in the sense that once again its military overreach, its imperial overreach, was dramatically illustrated. And the impossibility, really, of trying to handle colonial government militarily. So Britain was basically humiliated for 2 years during the course of this war. By the end of the war, there were something like 450,000 British troops over in South Africa, and they were fighting basically a guerrilla war with less than 100,000 Afrikaan soldiers. And the guerrilla nature of that warfare was really what caught Britain out. There were 3 very famous sieges where British troops were held in Ladysmith, in Mafeking and Kimberley. The reports of those sieges were followed very closely in the British press. And Britain began to use increasingly novel tactics, shall we say, for the conduct of this war. And so to deal with the question of the mobility of the combatants they were fighting, they introduced concentration camps. They introduced camps where they would round up African women and children and men where they were around and put them in concentration camps, sometimes known as refugee camps, to make sure that those people were unable to support Afrikaans fighters. And they did the same also, different camps for the black African population. Now, the conditions in these camps became infamous. And they became infamous through the reporting of Emily Hobhouse in the Manchester Guardian and Henry Massingham in the Daily Chronicle. They, first of all, highlighted the fact that these camps existed, and second of all, exposed the very high rates of mortality within them. There were in total something like 34 camps holding vast numbers of Afrikaans and black Africans. The figures are very difficult and highly contested, but reasonably safe figures as something like 25,000 Afrikaans die and 14,000 black Africans. And they represent about 25 and 10% of the populations of those people held in camps. There's an official commission set up to investigate the conditions in this camp, interestingly headed up by Millicent Fawcett, the leader of the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies. But it fails basically to quell the criticism. And very famously, the Liberal MP, Henry Campbell Bannerman, asked questions about these camps in the House of Commons and said that equated them to the use of methods of barbarism. How come the British Empire is relying on these barbaric methods when it's meant to be a force of good? Far from civilizing, it is indeed creating barbaric conditions. Okay, I think I can do this. I still have quite a lot of stuff to get through, so I'm not going to ask you for questions, I'm afraid. Okay, so the point there was basically that the empire becomes politically very contentious and that the old idea of it as being a benevolent and civilizing force becomes increasingly questioned. Now, you'll know already from the lecture on Tuesday that there is growing anxiety, not just about the scale of poverty in Britain, but the racial health of the population as a whole. And you must pinch yourself and remember that the beginning of the 19th century is one where the preoccupation is about overpopulation. The question for Malthus was, how could populations be sustained? By the late 19th century, that question had basically disappeared. And now the issue was one of how can we handle declining fertility? Why is the population not growing as rapidly as it once was? And more importantly, why are the wrong type of people reproducing? Why is it the working poor that are having more children than the respectable classes? And what are the consequences of that? It was, of course, in these conditions that you have the growth of social Darwinism and eventually of eugenics. Francis Galton is the person who basically begins the science of eugenics in the 1880s, developing a whole series of types of biometric measures to try and figure out how it is that one could perfect the racial health of a population. And I want to make it very clear to you that this concern with the racial health of the population and this interest in eugenics was not something that only nutters at the far right of the political spectrum were interested in. These were ideas that were infused people across all political parties. So the Pankhurst, for instance, Emily Pankhurst, you'll remember in The Great Scourge, is primarily concerned with racial health. It's true of figures like Sidney and Beatrice Webb in the Fabian movement that becomes part of the Labour Party, and it's true of figures like Balfour and Churchill on the Conservative Party as well. Indeed, such is the concern about the scale of the deteriorating scale of Britain's racial health that a special department, a special commission, is formed in 1904, the Interdepartmental Committee on Physical Deterioration. And that is a hugely important committee because it recommends a whole series of measures that would become part of the platform of the so-called New Liberal Party that is elected in 1906 for much more interventionist social program that I'll show you in a minute. But this wasn't all about state intervention. It was also about the animation of civil society itself. The question was, how could you raise girls and boys who would be well adapted to ensuring the future racial superiority of the British? Now, for boys, this was all about physical education. It was all about the inculcation of new forms of militarism. And the best example of all here is the Boy Scouts formed by Baden-Powell, who had been one of the heroes of the siege in Ladysmith at the South African War. But the Boy Scouts were by no means alone. There were a whole series of organisations, the Boys Brigade, the Empire Youth Movement, the League of Empire, the British Empire Union. All of these organisations were set up in the in the last decade of the 19th and the first decade of the 20th century. This idea of an adventurous, masculine, determined male was in many ways wonderfully illustrated in the disaster of Scott's expedition to the Antarctic. Scott became a hero in Britain, not because of his failure, although Britons do like people that fail greatly, but because of the sheer determination that his expedition entailed. But there were also new types of demons as well as new types of heroes. And if you have to have an ideal type of boy or man, so you have to have its antithesis. And it's no coincidence that it's in the decades after 1885 that you have the pathologization, the criminalization of homosexuality. The identification of homosexuality with a particular form of effeminate man that became classically illustrated in the figure of Oscar Wilde. Girls had to be taught, in contrast, how to be good mothers. Girls were thought to be literally the engineers of the race in that sense. If you could teach a girl to be a good mother, she would have strong and healthy children. And one of the recommendations of the Interdepartmental Committee on Physical Deterioration were almost entirely concerned with the welfare of women and children. So it recommended the use of school meals to feed hungry children and to make sure that they were not challenged by their malnutrition. It recommended the medical inspection of children at schools so that the scale of degeneration or the improvement of racial health could be mapped. It recommended the notification of births so that the state would be immediately aware of all children born, and it introduced the Children's Act of 1909, which outlawed the sale of liquor to children, and the practice of overlaying, of having children basically in your bed. It also set up a whole new set of state services, like the use of midwives to enable women to have births, health visitors to go and visit women after they've had children, and the introduction of domestic science, or what is called here household economy? No, household home economics, thank you, in the school curriculum. I just don't have time to do this. Sorry, I don't have time to do this. I've got too many other things to talk about. The key point that you need to know here is that Britain's first ever Immigration Act is passed in 1905, restricting who can come into the country. Britain had always thought of itself as the home of liberty, where anyone could come to Britain and be free. In 1905, it introduces an Aliens Act, which is expressly concerned to stop Jewish immigration, because from the 1880s, there had been a flow of poor Jewish immigrants from the pogroms in what we now think of as, well, what we once thought of as Eastern Europe and Southern Russia. Jewish immigration, particularly in London, helped catalyze a series of racist responses to it in organizations like the British Brothers League, whose handbill for a meeting you can see here. It's often argued by historians that the Aliens Act was introduced in 1904, 1905 to try and help the Conservative Party hold on to power. Remember, the Conservative Party gets elected in 1900. There's an election in 1906. And here we have a good example of the Conservatives trying to use the patriotism, immigration, empire as a way of shoring up its electoral support. Having said I didn't have time to do it, I just did it. But now I really have to crack on because I have a lot of stuff to get through in the next 20 minutes. This is what I have to cover. Should be easy. This is mad. So I'm going to talk about the labour movement. I'm going to talk very, very briefly about women's suffrage, and then Ireland again, all too briefly. I've said very little in this class so far about the rise of the labour movement. When I was an undergraduate sitting in chairs like you are now, we were taught that the labour movement basically stretched back into the deep mists of time, and certainly the early 19th century and sometimes even the late 18th century. And it was hooked to the story of the Industrial Revolution that's happening around that time. I don't think the labour movement really becomes a labour movement in Britain until the late 19th century, and I think it takes two shapes. I think it's about the growth of trade unionism, which had been decriminalised. Remember the Combination Acts in the late 18th and early 19th century had once criminalised it. But the trade union movement radically changes shape and form in the late 19th century that gives it a lot more power in collective bargaining and in strike action. And it does so because it reorganizes itself by sector, not by skill. Okay, so let me explain what that means. That you would have unions that would, for instance, represent textile workers, not, as in the past, a union representing just spinners or just weavers. Okay? It tried to represent all the workers in that sector. And this is why it's known as New Unionism, because it tried to break down the hierarchies of craft and skill differentiation. Well, not break them down, but try and incorporate them in a collective effort. Trade union membership rose very dramatically during this period. It had reached 2 million in 1900 and had doubled to 4 million by 1914, would almost double again by the end of the First World War. And the union movement became increasingly confrontational in its tactics, or rather less adverse to strike action. There were a series of very important strikes in 1880s, catalyzed in large part by the growth of unemployment, of people being laid off work, and of the declining prices, which put a great squeeze on wages for employers. The Match Girls strike in 1888 and the gas and dock workers strike in 1889. This meant, this new articulate, confident trade union movement meant that political parties began to compete to try and represent the so-called labour interest. Everybody wanted to claim that it was the best political vehicle for members of the union movement. And so it's at this point that you have political parties that actually think of themselves as representing this labour interest. The Social Democratic Federation is a good example of that. The Independent Labour Party is a good example of that. But mainly these various forms of political representation of the labour interest on the left, outside the Liberal Party, came together in this organisation known as the Labour Representation Committee. It was like a coalition, if you like, of left-leaning parties. And yet, the Liberal Party still had a very strong hold and purchase on these organisations. Thus, the Labour Representation Committee had a pact with the Liberal Party in 1903 where they would not put up, they agreed that there would be the constituencies where they wouldn't compete against each other. And historians would now say that up until the First World War, the Labour Party is basically only strong in very specific local areas. In East London, where the Liberal Party had never been very strong, in Clydeside, up in Scotland, and in the West Riding in the old areas of the wool industry, i.e. the very areas where the Liberal Party had never really had a grip. Many people, of course, felt themselves unrepresented by the trade union movement, and that was particularly true of the unemployed. And so it's no coincidence that you have the first ever hunger march in the world in 1905 by workers who have no other means of articulation. The trade union movement, if you're unemployed, no trade union movement represents you. And so the movements for the unemployed were very important in the decades from 1905 through to the 1930s, and I'll have more to say of those later. So the trade union movement has its own critics within amongst the unemployed. Last thing I want to say here is that there is a dramatic few years of unprecedented large-scale industrial unrest in the years between 1909 and 1912. Some people would say that it had began in 1907. There was a big railway strike in 1907. There was coal miners went on strike in 1908. But it's really the massive strike by the so-called Great Transportation Strike of 1912 and the strike by dock workers leading up to that that saw an unprecedented scale of striking and of unprecedented use of force against those on strike. So 4 strikers were shot dead when the police tried to break up a dock strike in Liverpool and in Llanelli in South Wales in 1911. This was unheard of territory. These types of strikes and this scale of strike action was unprecedented. As I said, one of the parties competing to represent the Labour interest was indeed the Liberal Party. And the Liberal Party embraces this philosophy of new liberalism that tries to come to terms with the fact that poverty and labour unrest were a consequence of forces beyond the control of individuals. That individuals were situated in economic relations over which they had very little control. And the real distinction between new liberalism and the liberalism of the Liberal Party that preceded it was that it's supposed to be about the scale of state intervention. Okay? But you know that the liberalism of the 19th century was full of state intervention. Think about the workhouse. Think about the Poor Law. Think about sanitation acts. The difference here is that in the middle of the 19th century, people who thought of themselves as liberals wanted to use the state to intervene upon those that they thought were not capable of self-government. Okay? So they pick upon those groups of the poor, the ignorant, or the unhealthy, or the unsanitary, etc., etc. New liberalism did something radically different. It wanted to use the state to help people realize their potential for self-government. It's a big, big difference. They wanted the state to help lift people up so they were capable of being able to look after themselves. And at the centerpiece of this action was David Lloyd George, who was Chancellor of the Exchequer, and who devised and implemented the so-called People's Budget in 1909. And the People's Budget was the centerpiece because it raised the revenue for a whole series of new measures. It expanded the scale of income tax. It introduced capital gains tax and death duties up to 25%. And just to show that he was a good liberal, also introduced new duties on alcohol and tobacco. Out of this money came the introduction of the old age pensions in 1909 and the introduction of national insurance in 1911. So the old age pension gave people over 75 shillings a week, and there were something like 1 million beneficiaries of that program. And national insurance provided protection on those who lost their earnings after 15 weeks for illness or unemployment. And it was put together by contributions both by employers and from the state. By 1914, something like 13 million British workers were covered under this program. Now, the radical nature of this program was evident by the fact that the House of Lords refused to pass the People's Budget. It refused to pass the People's Budget. And this produced a profound constitutional crisis, that the elected government was trying to pass a very important fiscal measure that was the basis of its social program, and the unelected House of Lords blocked it. Over the course of 2 years, this produced 2 elections and culminated in the passage of the Parliament Act in 1911, which effectively removed the House of Lords' right of veto over financial measures. So if you're looking for a moment when the aristocracy loses an important part of its political power, 1911 would be a very good place to look. Now, we've covered a lot of this ground already, so what I'm going to say about the women's suffrage movement was that the Women's Social and Political Union, rather like new unionists, began to adopt increasingly militant strategies for the purpose of dramatizing the exclusion of women from the vote. In 1905, they began disrupting the meetings of the Liberal Party leaders and MPs. In 1908, they began to launch attacks on public property, mainly, silly things like, setting letterboxes on fire, some other arson attacks. In 1909, they begin to conduct hunger strikes. The government is so appalled at the prospect of potentially being custodians of hunger striking suffragettes who die, that they introduce this measure, the Cat and Mouse Act, which tries to manage the problem by releasing women who declare a hunger strike, letting them out of jail until such time where they recover their physical strength, and then trying to rearrest them and put them back into jail. Okay? Not a great strategy. And of course, it was hopelessly unsuccessful. But it was a better alternative than the use of force feeding, which you see illustrated behind me, because this is basically what they did from 1909 down to 1913, and then again in the second half of 1913 and 1914 when they abandoned the Cat and Mouse Act. They introduced forcible feeding straight out of mental health asylums. And it becomes hugely contentious, both within the medical profession itself, whether doctors should be used as instruments of the state, but also within the population as a large. And the suffragettes used it to illustrate that women's subjugation, the denial of the vote to women, could only be maintained by the use of physical force against them. They were saying, look, it's not our militancy which is the issue here. It's the illiberal use of force by a liberal government and a liberal state which should be brought to the attention of people. And lastly, Ireland, and in a way most importantly. So you remember that Gladstone had introduced the first Home Rule Bill in 1886. He has another go in the dying embers of his last administration in 1893. And there is, which actually passed. The 1893, the Home Reform Bill, Home Rule Bill of 1893 is passed by the House of Commons with a majority of 34. It's rejected by the House of Lords. 1912, there's another Home Rule Bill. And the House of Lords basically does its best to reject it for as long as it possibly can, which was two years. But after 2 years, it was going to lose its ability to throw the measure out. And what this does is catalyze the Protestant minority in Ireland to reject the bill. And so you have the beginning of paramilitary mobilization in Ireland. Well, not the beginning, but an important phase of paramilitary organization with the launch of the Ulster Volunteer Force in 1913, and then the response of the nationalist movement also in the to try and counteract the threat of the Ulster Volunteer Force, which claimed it had something like 300,000 members. No, that's totally wrong. Sorry, I've just given you a figure for something completely different. Anyway, let me move on, because the key issue here is that the Home Rule Bill is finally passed in 1914. But with the baddest of all possible luck, it's passed in August of 1914 and then suspended the following month when Britain declares war on Germany and the First World War begins. The leader of the Irish nationalists, John Redmond, immediately commits his supporters to supporting the war effort, and vast numbers of people, 300,000, volunteer to join up. There was no conscription in Ireland until very, very late. It was the suspension of Home Rule that here again split the nationalist movement. And there were those who refused to let the war provide a break to the claims of the Irish nation for independence from Britain. And they, very small minority, launched a rising in April 1916, an attempt to take armed control of the state. They captured the Dublin post office and sought to use that as the basis of a wider mobilization against the British state. But in fact, all those people that were meant to join them around the country evaporate, and there is a violent suppression of the rising in Britain. You see behind me the destruction of the Dublin post office where they were holed up fighting. 500 people are killed during the repression of the movement, and 15 of its leaders were executed by the British. So again, here we have another illustration of the use of physical force to maintain not just the empire, but to keep the use of physical force against those making their claim to the universal rights promised for citizenship. Okay, I feel so inarticulate today. So I can't wait to conclude and get out of here. My only excuse is that I got off a plane at midnight last night. Okay, so let me try and wrap up. And what I've been trying to say to you today is that key to these series of lectures is the recognition that Britain is operating in a new type of global era in the late 19th and early 20th century. And that fundamentally altered the ways in which liberalism, the liberalism that had triumphed and become the common sense during the 19th century, had to be adjusted and challenged. It was in this era of global competition that these fundamental challenges to liberalism were made manifest. To free trade and the idea of cheap government, which you can see with the new liberal, after the People's Budget had gone out of the window in some ways. To the idea of a benevolent, civilizing empire in India, in South Africa, in Ireland, became a clear fiction. To the idea of the rule of law, which both across the empire and in Britain itself seemed to be suspended at will when the British state wanted to put down those people who were campaigning for their rights or making claims upon the state. And finally, the idea that eventually everybody was going to get the right to be represented. That universal claim or promise of liberalism that one day when you're big enough, when you're grown up enough, you too will be treated like an adult and get the right to vote. All of these things were dramatically exposed to be a fiction in the decades that I've been talking about today. And importantly, they're exposed as a fiction by political mobilization, not just in Britain, but across its empire as well. Ireland and India are a really key part of this story. Now, the big question that you have to figure out before you get into the midterm is whether you think that these challenges that I've been talking about today and the challenges that I'm going to talk about in the First World War on Tuesday meant that this era, this liberal era of the 19th century came to an end. This is a question that has preoccupied historians of Britain for decades. And so you have to try and figure out quite how widespread, how significant these challenges were, and what was left of the idea of liberal England at the end of the First World War. And if you do that, you'll be in good shape for the midterm. Does anyone have any questions that I can try and answer and clarify some of the absolute tripe that I've just given you? I just threw an enormous amount of different things at you, and in an utterly inarticulate way for 90% of the time. So someone must have a question. Thank you, Eric, sporting that very fine new haircut. Oh, history coming to a period. There's a great book that I'll talk to you about on Tuesday called 1066 and all that. And it's a triumphal account of Britain's past, rather similar to the triumphal version of Britain's past that the current Minister of Education wants to make compulsorily taught in British schools. And it has this idea that at the end of the First World War, America becomes top dog, and therefore history comes to a period, because Britain is no longer at the centre. But I'll cover that on, I'm not sure why I've got that there, just to confuse you. Any other questions? Yeah?
You say that liberalism comes to an end, or that it rightly should?
Well, dun dun dun, that is the question that only you can answer. And on that note, we're going to end.